Hi, my name's Penny, and today I wanted to talk about the books that I read in January. So I'm actually pretty impressed with the amount of books I read in January, considering I started a new job that has a bit of an annoying commute. But still, I managed to read quite a few things, so let's talk about them. The first book is book 5 of the first series, called The Sacred Veil by Christopher Pike. So I started reading this last year, and the good thing is that this series finished. I can tick it off my list. The bad thing, which I think I already mentioned in my TBR, is that the last 2 books of this series were rather disappointing. The series follows a woman called Alyssa, who is the last vampire. The series, I've said a million times, was originally released as the Last Vampire series. There were 6 books in the series. I read them as a teenager. I loved them. Then I discovered many years later, because it's been a long time since I was a teenager, I discovered that he had bundled the books up into some new books and then released even more books in the series. So I was really excited. And to be honest, I think that I liked it's not the direction that this went in. So this gets into, there's a whole nother immortal race that gets brought into. There's kind of this idea of gods perhaps being aliens, and goes to the afterlife, and there's also a whole bunch of stuff about human psychic abilities. But I think I worked out what disappointed me was just the lack of action. These books are really slow, which compared to the original books were so fast paced, and just that's what I loved about them, was that Alyssa was just constantly on to the next thing, working through what was going on and working things through, but through action. Whereas this, every time she's working things through, it's just a lot of thinking, and I got bored. So it's a bit disappointing, but that's life. So the next book I read was Nice Guys Bite by Jennifer Estep. So this is part of the Elemental Assassin series, and this is a novella that fits between book 15 and 16, so this is a really long series. The series follows a woman named Jin, who is also an assassin, who goes by the name of the Spider. She has elemental powers and lives in this town where they have quite a lot of criminals, but they also have dwarves and giants and vampires, but they're quite realistic vampires, dwarves, and giants, in that they're just integrated into society, even though there's still this criminal aspect that they often get pulled into. And really the story is about Jin building up this found family and the people that she takes care of, although often she ends up needing to kill bad people in order to take care of her friends and family. But this novella follows her assistant Silvio, and he is, in the beginning of the story, he's going on a date with this man that he's met, and Jin's very excited for him. But as things always happen in the series, things go badly. We end up with a whole bunch of fighting and violence and twists and turns. Just like all of these books, every chapter just makes you want to read the next chapter. She's really good at keeping that pacing going. So they're always really quick reads. And this novella was no different. In fact, it was really short, so it was a super quick read, which is part of why I read it at the start of the year, just to give myself a little head start and make me feel like I'm doing a good job at reading. The other reason I read it is because it was kind of the only outstanding book from that series that I needed to read. So now I'm caught up on this series, and I just have to wait for book number 17 to come out, which should hopefully be soon. So then the next book that I listened to was We Are Legion, We Are Bob by Dennis E. Taylor. And in fact, I ended up reading the whole trilogy this month because I really enjoyed it. I think a lot of that came down to the narrator. He just had such a great style that it felt like the actual characters were telling me their story. So this series follows this man who dies and gets himself cryogenically frozen, with the plan that he'll be resurrected some point in the future when technology is able to do it. As it turns out, the world goes crazy to some degree, as the world often does. and he ends up being woken up, but he's now the AI in a spaceship. And it's a spaceship that can clone itself, so he's expected to clone himself and spread out through the universe, finding new places for humans to live. So I did really enjoy all the different Bob's versions and the stories that they follow. Was sometimes some of the stories were a little bit less interesting than others, and they didn't always, like, most of the stories were very separate because they are all in different parts of the universe. So sometimes it was a bit weird because there was a very intense storyline going on that threatened the whole future of humanity, and then we jump back to this romance story that was going on that, in contrast, didn't really seem that important. But I do think that even the less important stories explored interesting aspects of artificial intelligence, and I don't really know how that could have been done without splitting it up with the other stories, so I guess it wasn't that much of a problem anyway. There were definitely parts where the pacing was a bit slow and it got into a lot of technical detail that wasn't really interested in, but because it was an audiobook, I could just kind of tune out in those bits and then remember to tune back in time for when something was actually happening. And I mean, really, I think it's pretty obvious I enjoyed these stories because I read the whole trilogy in 1 month. I do think, though, that I enjoyed it more than I would have if I'd read the physical book, which, to be honest, I've been struggling with audiobooks a little bit. I often don't like them as much as I'm hoping to. So that was really a surprise, and I'm really glad that I read this trilogy, and I would recommend it, especially if you're interested in artificial intelligence and space travel and exploration of the universe. So the next book that I read were the Angel and Faith Season 10 comic bind-ups. I actually read, there's 4 books here, and I actually read the 5th one on my iPad. I do think that the art seemed to be going a little bit downhill in this series, and in fact I read the next 2 books of Buffy Season 11, and that's possibly even worse, so that's not very good. And in this story as well, it really is investigating Angel and Faith learning that they can't just depend on themselves, they need to depend on others, which is a story that both of them have learned like a million times. So I think that Angel and Faith this season was a little bit disappointing. Like, actually, I don't even remember that much of it. Oh, I do remember one thing that happened is somewhat spoilers, but most of you probably don't care. And I won't spoil it too much. So we do get some Fred in here, who is one of the characters from the TV series of Angel, and we haven't seen her in the comic series at all, I don't think. So here you can see Faith is a long-haired brunette, Fred is also a long-haired brunette, and most of the time I couldn't tell them apart. So when Fred appeared, you're meant to be like, oh my god, it's Fred, but I was just like, is that Faith? She looks weird. But there were some pages that I did really like the art of, and I'm glad I read it because this puts me another step closer to catching up on the series. And in fact, after I read these ones, I read Buffy Season 11, the first 2 volumes which are out. The next ones are yet to be released. So with Buffy Season 11, as I said, I think the art was going downhill quite a lot. Some of the pictures of Buffy were just like, what is wrong with her face? And I'm really surprised that that was even allowed to be released, to be honest. I believe that the actors have the rights to withdraw permission for artists to portray them in the Buffy series, and I would have thought that if Sarah Michelle Gellar had seen some of these pictures, she would have been like, no, don't do that. But I guess they only showed her the good pictures. What I did like about Buffy Season 11 though is that it's kind of built upon this metaphor of what's going on in our real world, and it allows it to explore some of those concepts. So at this point in Buffy's season, pretty much the whole world knows about magic, and the army has gotten involved with fighting evil creatures a lot more than they were in the TV series. It's pretty much just part of everyone's regular life. But also magic has been getting more and more out of control. So what the government decides to do is take everybody who's magical and put them into like a particular area where they're sort of separated from the regular people, so the regular people can be safe. So then in this area you've got vampires, demons, witches, people who are mostly normal but just have a little bit of magic. And Buffy ends up in there herself because, of course, as a Slayer, she is a magical person. But Dawn and Xander still get to remain out in the real world because, well, even though Dawn is a magical person, nobody knows. And Xander, of course, is the most boring person in the world, so he's fine. But it's interesting, you know, the guilt that Dawn feels about the fact that she is magical, but she's pretending she's not. And she feels like she should be defending her friends that are in this camp, and also stuff about how dangerous it is within the camp, even though there's a lot of good people in there, and what they're trying to do about that situation. I guess it's just dealing with this prejudice against magical people, even though a lot of them are completely fine. So I quite enjoyed this story and the themes that they're exploring, but just the art. So I am looking forward to the rest of the series. I think the next book comes out later in February. Wow, I can't talk. And hopefully my library will get it pretty quickly so I can read it. I definitely won't be looking to purchase it because the art is too terrible. Whereas there's some of the earlier Buffy seasons that I would like to own more of because the art was just amazing. So it's a bit sad that it's gone downhill like that. Okay, I feel like this is really long, so I probably should have done, considering how much I read, like a mid-January wrap-up, as I have been doing mid-month wrap-ups, but I thought that I wouldn't read enough this month, so there was no point doing it. Oops. Anyway, I only have 2 more books to talk about. So the next one that I read was Thornlost, which is part of the Glass Thorns trilogy by Melanie Rawn. So this trilogy is another one that I'm trying to get to. This is book 3, and I think there are 5 books in the series, so I'm getting close. And these books are weird. I actually think I enjoyed it more than I was expecting to based on the previous books in the series. But I can't tell if that was just because I got what I was expecting or because it had actually improved. Could be either way. These books are weird. So they follow this theatre troupe who uses magic as part of their theatre experience. They use magic to make the audience feel the emotions that are part of the play that they're telling. And it pretty much just follows mainly the two of the theatre group in the events that happen in their lives and as they go on this royal circuit with the theatre group. And it's kind of weird because I feel like nothing ever really happens. It's just a whole bunch of like unrelated events. But I did, as I read through this one, I wrote down all the themes that were being covered, and it's actually amazing how many themes are being covered. So if I wrote it down, I read it. It covers like team relationships, which you hardly ever get any of in fiction, really. It talks about unhealthy relationships. It's got a theatre group. It's got team-based magic, so the theatre magic that they do, they work as a team and they all have different parts, which is most magic systems are very individual based. There's also a lot of stuff in there about the creative process and about researching history and writing. One of the main characters has like these visions of the future, but the visions are set up where he only will have visions of things where his decisions and his actions can affect what happens. So, and like when he changes something, he'll have a vision of how things have changed. And so it has quite a big impact on how he reacts to things. There's also a whole lot about racism and sexism in there because in the theatre group, women aren't allowed to go to the theatre, whereas the theatre group actually would quite like them to be able to. And there's also a whole bunch of different magical races, but most people are a blend of different races. But if you have particular magical creature blood in you, you might exhibit certain traits. And some people are very prejudiced against that. And there's one particular theatre group that seems to be trying to push that prejudice and increase it, which the others don't really like. Domestic violence is dealt with as a theme, and drug abuse. There's a bit about fame, which relates to that, about how people respond to fame, because this theatre group is now starting to get quite famous. And there's a little bit in there as well about them trying to create a theatre for deaf people and maybe even blind people in the future, so kind of disabilities are addressed. So that's all the themes that I wrote down, which is quite a lot, and so you'd think, wow, it covers so much, but it never really covers any of it in very much depth, and there's not really an overarching story. Like, I used to feel like this story was getting to something. I mean, there is a mystery with the Archduke is definitely up to no good, but I don't really know what he's up to, and I don't really know if the story's ever going to really be that involved in whatever's going on. So I don't know if I can recommend this book or this series. I think if you're into very character-based stories and you think some of those themes were interesting, you might like it. But they are very long, so it's quite a lot to get through just to get a little bit of the theme that you're interested in, because of course all the other themes are in there too. Okay, so then the last book that I read is a book I borrowed from my sister, and that is Steadfast by Mercedes Lackey. So this is the 8th book in the series, and I think the 13th book is going to be released this year, so I'm catching up. Each book in this series is a retelling of a fairy tale, but told in this historical London where there are elemental masters who each have different elemental powers. The last couple of books I've read in this series, and this book was no exception, is that she leaves the action until the very last chapters of the book. So it's very like the character is just learning about magic, and it's very slow, and we're just getting to know the characters, and you know that there's this conflict probably going to happen, and it builds up, eventually it happens, and then everything's fine. Which is okay, although like I found in this one we've got it's telling the story of the tin soldier, the steadfast tin soldier, which I don't really know, but in that fairy tale there's this tin soldier who's been made and he's missing a leg, hence this guy with the cane, and he falls in love with this ballerina, and then some bad stuff happens and eventually they both burn in a fire. It's not a very nice fairy tale. I think it's Hans Christian Andersen. Could be wrong. But anyway, in this one we've got this guy who's a fire master, and he fought in the war, so he is missing a leg. He has one wooden leg, and he works at this theatre as the doorman. There's also this guy who does a theatre performance, and he is an air magician. This girl runs away from her husband who has been abusing her and finds a position as the air master's assistant, and it turns out that she is also a fire magician, probably not a master. Now, she doesn't know anything about her magical powers, but she learns about them throughout this book. And eventually, right at the end of the book, her husband comes back and she has to deal with that situation. There's a fire, of course, and then everything's fine. I really would have liked it if they had the husband around for more time, or spent more time with the husband and really spent more time developing that theme. Like, they mostly focused on the main girl, I've forgotten her name, Katie. They mostly focus on Katie learning about her magic, but I would have liked it if they'd spent, because that's a theme that's been covered a million times in a million books, but a million of these books. So it would have been better if they'd explored what it's like to deal with abuse a bit more. So it was a bit disappointing, but again, I got through it pretty easy. I know some of these books I've been very frustrated with how slow they are, so I don't know, maybe I was just more patient this month, and that's why Thorn Lost and this book didn't seem so bad. Maybe it's not the books, maybe it's me. Anyway, this I have filmed for a long time, so I hope there's a whole bunch of rubbish that I can cut out, or this video is really long. I'd love if you've read any of the books that I talked about today to talk to you about them down in the comments, or let me know if there's any other books you think I'd like based on the books that I read this month. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time.